In the heart of the Mekong Delta, where the rivers twist like silver snakes through endless rice paddies, a boy was born into a world at war. His name was Nguyen Van Bay. He wasn't born in an air base, he wasn't raised among machines or taught by generals. He was the son of a humble farmer, a boy whose hands knew only the texture of soil, not steel. Yet from those muddy fields, destiny would lift him higher than any mountain. He would one day face America's most powerful pilots and prove that courage, not technology, defines the sky. The year was 1936. Vietnam, then called French Indochina, lived under colonial rule. For generations, farmers like Bay's family toiled on land that was not truly theirs. From sunrise to dusk, Nguyen helped his father plant rice, carrying heavy baskets on his thin shoulders. But even as a child, his eyes often turned upward to the sky. Airplanes would sometimes roar above, and the boy would stop working, staring with quiet awe. To him, those machines were not symbols of power. They were freedom itself. Then came war. The French were driven out, and a new Vietnam began to rise, divided, uncertain, and restless. Bay was just a teenager when he joined the revolutionary movement, the Viet Minh, fighting not for glory but for independence. He fought in the shadows, carrying supplies, guiding soldiers through the jungles, learning discipline, endurance, and sacrifice. He wasn't a commander. He was just another nameless soldier in a war that seemed endless. But inside him, there burned a quiet determination. If my country must fight for its freedom, then I will fight with it. After the Geneva Accords in 1954, Vietnam was split in two, the Communist North and the American-backed South. Bay, now in his 20s, refused to live under foreign influence. He crossed the 17th parallel, walking hundreds of kilometers north, leaving behind everything he knew. He didn't speak of heroism. He didn't dream of medals. He simply wanted to serve, to protect the soil his ancestors had died for. In Hanoi, he worked as a mechanic, fixing old vehicles and tractors. He was quiet, modest, and hard-working. But something about his focus, his steady hands, and his patience caught the attention of military recruiters. The North Vietnamese Air Force was searching for new pilots, and one day, Bay's name was on the list. When he received the call, he was stunned. He had never even touched an airplane. He didn't know what flying truly meant. But he said yes. The Soviet Union had agreed to train a select group of young Vietnamese men in aviation. It was an impossible dream, turning farmers into fighter pilots, but the Soviets saw something in them: determination, humility, and an iron will to learn. Nguyen Van Bay was sent to the Soviet Flight Academy, far from his tropical homeland. For the first time he saw snow. He struggled with the language, and the cockpit instruments looked like an alien world. But he studied harder than anyone, every manual, every procedure, every maneuver. When others gave up, he stayed late, asking his instructors questions through broken Russian and gestures. He was determined to earn his wings, not for himself, but for Vietnam. One of his instructors later said, "He was not the fastest, not the strongest, but he was the most focused man I ever met." Bay's training jet was a MiG-17, a sleek Soviet design, small, agile, and deadly in the hands of the right pilot. He fell in love with it instantly. The way it moved through the sky reminded him of the swift birds he used to watch over the rice fields. While the Americans were building supersonic fighters like the F-4 Phantom, capable of breaking the sound barrier, the Vietnamese would rely on skill, patience, and the advantage of terrain. Their MiGs were slower, but they could turn sharper. They could ambush. They could vanish into the clouds and strike from nowhere. That was how Nguyen Van Bay thought, not like a machine, but like a hunter. When his training ended, he was offered the choice: stay as an instructor or return home to join the war effort. His answer was immediate. "I will go home," he said. "My country needs me." In 1965, he returned to Vietnam, a fully trained fighter pilot of the 921st Sourdough Regiment, the Red Star Squadron. He was no longer the farmer's son. He was a soldier of the sky. The war had changed by then. The United States had entered Vietnam in full force, with hundreds of aircraft and aircraft carriers stationed off the coast. Villages were bombed, cities burned, and the sky thundered day and night. Nguyen Van Bay looked up and whispered to himself, "So this is where my wings belong." He climbed into his MiG for the first combat sortie of his life, heart racing, sweat running down his neck. He didn't know if he would return, but he knew why he was there. To him, the war was not about politics or ideology. It was about something far simpler: a man defending the land where he was born. As his jet roared down the runway and lifted off into the pale dawn sky, he felt something he had never felt before: a strange calm. The farmer who once worked barefoot in the rice fields was now chasing thunder across the heavens. And in the skies of Vietnam, a legend was about to be born. When Nguyen Van Bay returned to Vietnam in 1965, the country he left behind no longer existed. The jungles trembled under the roar of American bombers. Villages that once grew rice now burned under napalm. The smell of smoke and metal filled the air. But for Bay, the sky had never felt more alive. He was home, and he had a mission. His new base was Phuoc Yen Airfield, just north of Hanoi. There, the 921st Red Star Squadron prepared for war. The pilots slept in bunkers carved into the earth, surrounded by sandbags and anti-aircraft guns. Every night they listened to the distant thunder of explosions. Every morning they checked their MiGs, simple machines patched together with whatever parts they could find. The Soviet instructors warned them, "You are outnumbered, outgunned, out-teched, but never outsmarted." That was their creed. They knew they couldn't match America's numbers, so they had to master the art of survival and turn every flight into an ambush. Bay learned quickly. He studied the flight patterns of American bombers and their escorts, memorizing their weaknesses. He understood that the U.S. relied on radar, on long-range missiles, and on formation flying. But radar couldn't see through the mountains, and formations couldn't react to chaos. So, chaos became his weapon. He practiced low-altitude flying, skimming treetops and riverbanks to avoid detection. He learned to use clouds and sunlight to blind enemy pilots, and he drilled one maneuver over and over again: a sharp vertical climb followed by a sudden dive, tricking faster jets into overshooting their targets. The Americans called it the Cobra Turn. To Bay, it was simply the dance of survival. The North Vietnamese pilots often flew with just a few gallons of fuel, enough for a few minutes of combat. Each mission was life or death. But Bay never complained. When asked how he felt before a mission, he smiled and said, "If I die, I'll die protecting my people. If I live, I'll fight again tomorrow." There was no bravado in his voice, only quiet conviction. His comrades admired him, not because he was fearless, but because he was steady. Even under fire, he stayed calm, giving clear instructions to younger pilots. He believed that courage wasn't loud, it was the silence between breaths. Then came the day that would test everything he had learned. April 3rd, 1965. American F-8 Crusader jets crossed into North Vietnam, heading straight for the Thanh Hoa Bridge, a vital supply route for the North. Destroying it would cripple the region. The Red Star Squadron was scrambled. Nguyen Van Bay climbed into his MiG-17, heart pounding, rain beating on the canopy. "Red One, taking off," he shouted into his radio. His MiG roared down the short runway and lifted into the gray sky. The hunt had begun. As the formation approached the American strike group, the air was thick with static and thunder. Bay saw them first, dark silhouettes cutting through the clouds. 4 Crusaders, fast, confident, deadly. The American pilots didn't expect resistance. They were veterans, flying superior machines with guided missiles and radar locks. To them, the MiG-17s were outdated relics, but relics can bite. Bay dove into the clouds, vanishing from radar. Seconds later, he burst out beneath the enemy formation, guns blazing. The Americans panicked. 1 Crusader broke formation, chasing him. That was his mistake. Bay pulled hard on the stick, flipping his MiG into a tight vertical loop. The Crusader followed, too fast, too close. And in that single heartbeat, the hunter became the prey. Bay rolled behind him, lined up his guns, and fired a burst. Tracer rounds streaked through the air, tearing into the enemy jet. A flash, smoke, then silence. The first American jet had fallen. That day, Nguyen Van Bay achieved Vietnam's first confirmed aerial victory against the U.S. Navy. News spread like wildfire. In the villages, people whispered his name with pride. In the barracks, soldiers celebrated. For the first time, the Vietnamese sky no longer belonged to the Americans. Bay didn't smile. He just looked at the horizon and said quietly, "One down, many to go." Over the following weeks, he continued to refine his tactics. He studied each battle like a chess match, learning from every mistake, every maneuver. He learned that American pilots relied heavily on technology, while his people relied on instinct. The MiG-17 was slower, yes, but it could turn inside the radius of an F-4 Phantom. And in close combat, turning radius meant life or death. He began teaching younger pilots, never chase speed, make the enemy chase you. When he overshoots, that's your kill. The lesson spread across squadrons. Before long, American pilots began to fear the low, sudden flash of silver in the clouds, the sign of a MiG-17 on the hunt. By mid-1965, Nguyen Van Bay had become a rising legend within the Vietnamese Air Force. He was still the same humble man. He ate with the mechanics, helped carry fuel drums, fixed his own plane. But to the Americans, he was already a ghost in the sky, a phantom that appeared and vanished before they could react. One American pilot, after barely escaping a dogfight, radioed back to base and said, "Whoever's flying that MiG, he's not fighting like a rookie, he's fighting like a demon." Every night, Bay would sit by his plane, polishing its surface with a rag. He would look at the stars and think of home, of the fields where he once worked barefoot, and the people who depended on him now. The next morning, he'd climb back into the cockpit, strap himself in, and take to the air once more. And above the clouds, amid fire and thunder, he would remind the world that courage is not measured in miles per hour, but in how long a man can hold his ground when the sky itself turns against him. War had come to the skies of Vietnam. By 1966, American aircraft ruled the daylight. Every hour, their thunder rolled across the land. B-52s bombing cities, F-105s striking bridges, and F-4 Phantoms patrolling the skies like steel predators. For many, it was hopeless. But for Nguyen Van Bay, it was destiny. He had already tasted victory once, his first kill, an American Crusader jet, but that was just the beginning. Now, Bay was no longer the farmer turned pilot. He was the hunter of the Red Star Squadron. Each day began before dawn. The pilots were briefed in dimly lit bunkers, smoke curling around their heads as they studied crude maps and hand-drawn diagrams of enemy routes. There were no computers, no radars of their own, only intuition and courage. They were told when the bombers would come. They never knew if they would come back. One mission stands out, June 17th, 1966. American F-4 Phantoms were approaching Hanoi. Their orders: destroy the city's defenses, break the spirit of the North. Nguyen Van Bay and his wingmen were scrambled to intercept. As they climbed through the clouds, Bay could feel his pulse sinking with the rumble of his MiG. The air shimmered with heat. Every second brought him closer to death, or immortality. Through the haze, he spotted them, two Phantoms flying side by side, their wings glinting in the sun, faster, bigger, deadlier, but overconfident. Bay tightened his grip on the control stick. His MiG-17 couldn't outrun them, but it could outturn them. That was his only chance. He dove low, using the sun to blind the enemy radar, then climbed sharply, a maneuver that American pilots didn't expect from the slower MiG. The Phantoms reacted too late. Bay rolled behind the trailing jet and opened fire. The rounds ripped through the Phantom's fuselage. Black smoke billowed out. The pilot ejected. A parachute blossomed against the sky. Bay pulled away just in time to avoid debris. Another American jet had fallen, and this time everyone saw it. When he landed, the airbase erupted in cheers. Mechanics hugged him. Commanders saluted him. But Bay stayed quiet, dust settling on his flight suit. He didn't celebrate kills. He only counted lives saved. Each plane I destroy, he said softly, means fewer bombs on our children. That was Nguyen Van Bay, a soldier of skill, but also of soul. To him, the war wasn't about scoring kills. It was about endurance, about making the sky belong to Vietnam again. Over the next year, Bay's name spread like wildfire. I fought dozens of dogfights, always outnumbered, always outgunned. Yet time and time again, he returned alive, his MiG riddled with bullet holes but still flying. In the spring of 1967, he earned his 7th confirmed victory, becoming one of Vietnam's top aces. The Americans had nicknamed him the Sky Dragon. To them, he was a ghost. To his people, a living legend. In one of his most famous engagements, Bay faced 7 enemy aircraft alone. 7 Phantoms against 1 MiG-17? It should have been suicide. But Bay didn't run. He used the clouds like camouflage, weaving in and out, forcing the Phantoms to break formation. Each time they tried to lock onto him, he vanished into the mist, only to appear behind them seconds later. For nearly 15 minutes, he danced with death, and somehow he survived. When he returned to base, his plane's tail was shredded, wings punctured, fuel almost gone. But he landed it smoothly, stepped out, and simply said, "MiG-17, still good." Everyone laughed, but in that laughter was all, because everyone knew that few men could fly like him and live to tell about it. By now, Nguyen Van Bay had become a symbol not just of skill, but of resistance. His calm defiance in the face of impossible odds gave the Vietnamese people hope. The newspapers called him Con Rong Tran Troy, the dragon in the sky, but Bay didn't believe in myths. He believed in discipline. Each night after combat, he would return to his quarters, open a small notebook, and jot down notes, maneuvers that worked, those that didn't, how enemy pilots reacted under pressure. He was not just a warrior, he was a teacher, building a playbook that would train the next generation of Vietnamese pilots. The Americans were puzzled. Their radar showed the same pattern over and over. MiG-17s appearing out of nowhere, striking with precision, then disappearing. It was unlike anything they had seen in Korea or World War II. U.S. analysts began studying captured radio logs and wreckage. They realized the truth. These weren't reckless pilots. They were organized, disciplined, and led by men like Nguyen Van Bay. One captured American pilot reportedly said, "We thought we were fighting peasants. Turns out we were fighting professionals." But Bay never forgot where he came from. Even as his fame grew, he remained the same quiet man who once worked barefoot in the mud. When asked by a journalist what made him such a good pilot, he smiled faintly and said, "Because I never stopped being a farmer." A farmer must know the weather, the wind, and when to strike. The sky is just another field. I just learned to plow it differently. That humility was his greatest strength, and perhaps the secret behind his unmatched survival. By 1968, Nguyen Van Bay was not only one of the most successful pilots in Vietnam, but also one of the most respected among his peers. He had faced death dozens of times. He had watched friends fall from the sky and vanish into the jungle below. Yet he continued to fly, because as long as the war raged, his duty was not finished. I will fight until the last day the sky needs defending. Those words would echo through generations of pilots after him. The farmer who became a pilot, the pilot who became a legend, and the legend who reminded the world that even the smallest nation can stand tall beneath the storm. This was not the end of Nguyen Van Bay's story. The greatest battles and the price of his legacy were yet to come. The year was 1967. The skies over North Vietnam had become a deadly chessboard. Every move could mean life or death. The United States Air Force, with all its might, had failed to crush the small, stubborn nation below, and at the center of this defiance was a single man, Nguyen Van Bay. By now, his name had become legendary among both sides. To the Vietnamese, he was a symbol of unbreakable courage. To the Americans, he was something else entirely, a ghost in the clouds, a name whispered with frustration and respect. In U.S. intelligence briefings, pilots were warned, if you see a MiG diving straight into the sun, it could be him. And if it's him, he's already behind you. Every time Bay took off, he knew the odds. He flew a MiG-17, a design from the early 1950s, slower with no radar and only a few minutes of fuel for combat. His opponents flew the F-4 Phantom, one of the most advanced fighters in the world, equipped with missiles, radar lock, and electronic guidance. It wasn't a fair fight, but Nguyen Van Bay never asked for fairness. He relied on instinct, training, and something even deeper, the spirit of survival that had carried him from the rice paddies to the skies. He would climb high into the sun, using its glare to blind enemy radar. Then, as phantoms passed below, he would dive like a falcon, his cannons roaring at point-blank range. When his bullet struck home, he never shouted or cheered. He simply banked away, returning to base in silence. 'Cause to Nguyen Van Bay, every kill was not a victory. It was a necessity. But even legends grow tired. By late 1967, Bay had fought in over 90 aerial engagements. He was now an instructor training younger pilots, men who had grown up hearing his name in songs and stories. They looked at him as more than a man. He was the Sky Dragon, the one who made the impossible look effortless. Yet Bay knew the truth. He had seen too many friends vanish in flames, too many empty bunks in the barracks. The war was not glorious. It was merciless. On April 30th, 1967, an urgent order came through. A massive wave of U.S. bombers was heading toward Hanoi. Dozens of escorts, hundreds of tons of ordnance. The air defense network scrambled every available pilot. Nguyen Van Bay, despite being exhausted, volunteered. He knew the skies that day would be hell, but as he said to his commander, "If not me, then who?" He took off at dawn, his MiG's nose slicing through low clouds tinted red by the rising sun. As he climbed, the radio filled with chaotic chatter. Dozens of enemy aircraft converging, missiles locking, sirens wailing. Bay pushed his MiG to its limit. At 15,000 feet, he spotted a formation of phantoms. 4 jets, tight pattern, perfect targets. If he could get close enough, he dove sharply, pulling nearly 9 Gs. The world blurred, his vision narrowed to a tunnel of light. He fired a burst, missed. The phantoms broke formation. Then came the counterattack. Missiles streaked past his cockpit, exploding in blinding flashes. Shrapnel rattled against his wings. Bay's left fuel line was hit. Smoke filled the cabin. He could have bailed out. He didn't. He leveled the MiG, scanned the sky, and found his moment. One phantom had exposed its belly in a sharp turn. He dove again, fired. The American jet disintegrated midair, flames scattering across the blue. Bay's aircraft trembled violently. He barely managed to control it, but he didn't crash. He landed the damaged MiG on a dirt strip near the Red River, smoke trailing behind him like a black flag. He stepped out, coughing, covered in soot. The mechanics ran to him, shouting, cheering. He just nodded. One more battle survived. One more field defended. Over the months that followed, Bay became more than a pilot. He was a symbol of human endurance. His calmness under fire was legendary. Even American pilots admitted they respected him. One U.S. flyer interviewed years later said, "He fought with honor. He never broke the rules of combat." You could feel that he was fighting for something pure. That was the difference. The Americans were fighting a war of strategy. Nguyen Van Bay was fighting a war of heart. Yet even heroes have breaking points. In one engagement late that year, Bay lost 2 of his closest comrades. They were young, barely 20, both trained under his watch. He found their wreckage days later, deep in the jungle. The silence of that discovery stayed with him forever. When he returned to base, he didn't speak for hours. He simply sat on the wing of his MiG, staring at the horizon. They were so young, he whispered. They didn't even get to see peace. The war had made him famous, but it had also taken pieces of his soul. Each mission became heavier, each victory quieter. He continued to fly, but with a new kind of determination, not to prove himself, but to ensure the sacrifices of his comrades weren't in vain. By the end of 1967, Nguyen Van Bay had 7 confirmed kills, though unofficial records suggest there were more. He was among the top 5 aces of the entire Vietnam War, respected by friend and foe alike. Yet the more his legend grew, the more he wished for one thing: silence, to return to the life he once had, to the fields, the soil, the peace of the land. That year he was awarded the Hero of the People's Armed Forces, Vietnam's highest honor. But when he received the medal, he refused the grand speech. He simply said, "I am just a pilot who flew to protect home, nothing more." And that humility, that quiet strength, that's what made Nguyen Van Bay more than a warrior. He was a man who fought for the right to live free, to see the sky above his homeland belong to its people again. As the 1960s drew to a close, Nguyen Van Bay's reign in the skies began to wane. New pilots took his place, new aircraft joined the fight. But his legend remained, passed down through every classroom, every air base, every story whispered by firelight. The Sky Dragon had done his part, and though the war still raged, Vietnam had found something it would never lose again. The war that burned the skies had finally ended. The guns went silent. The planes that once roared like dragons above Hanoi now rested, rusting in hangars. The land, scarred by fire, began to heal, one grain of rice, one drop of rain at a time. And among those who returned to the earth was the man who had once ruled the skies, Nguyen Van Bay. When the world looked at him, they saw a war hero, 7 confirmed victories, one of Vietnam's greatest aces, a name that had terrified American pilots and inspired countless young Vietnamese. But when Nguyen Van Bay looked in the mirror, he saw something simpler: a farmer. A man who had once held a plow before he ever held a control stick. So after years in the air, he returned to the ground, to the soil, the water, the slow rhythm of life he had always loved. He could have stayed in the military. He could have become a general, a politician, a figure of power. But Bay wanted none of it. When asked by the party to take a position in command, he politely declined. "I don't need an office," he said. "My place is with my people." So he went home to Long On Province, to the same humble fields where his story began. There, he built a small house beside the Mekong River and started farming again. But the war never truly left him. Sometimes when the night was quiet, he would sit outside and look up at the stars, at the moonlight reflecting on the water, and he would hear them again, the engines, the echoes of dogfights, the radio static of comrades long gone. He carried them all with him, every pilot who never came back, every friend whose plane vanished into clouds of smoke. "I still remember their names," he once said, "every one of them. The sky remembers too." Despite his quiet life, people still came from across the country to meet him. Young pilots, students, foreign journalists, they came to shake his hand, to hear his stories, to see the man who fought the most powerful air force in the world and survived. He never acted like a celebrity. He'd welcome them into his small wooden house, pour them tea, and listen more than he spoke. When asked what made him so successful as a fighter pilot, his answer was always the same: discipline, patience, and love. Love for your homeland, for your people. Without love, courage means nothing. In one interview, a reporter asked him, "Do you hate the Americans you fought?" He smiled softly and shook his head. "No, I never hated them. They were soldiers like me. They followed orders. The real enemy was the war itself." That sentence silenced the room. because it came not from politics or pride, but from wisdom, the kind that only comes from seeing too much death and still choosing kindness. Years passed, Vietnam changed. Skyscrapers rose where craters once were. Children grew up free to play beneath the same skies he once defended. And through it all, Nguyen Van Bay remained the same, humble, patient, always working his land. He would often fix his own tools, mend the fences, tend to his small garden. Visitors would sometimes find him barefoot, knees in the mud, laughing quietly as he worked. To them, it was strange, a national hero living like a simple man. But that was exactly how he wanted it. "I am happiest when I see the fields green again," he said, "because that means we have peace." In the 2000s, when Vietnam began to share more of its wartime history with the world, his name returned to headlines. Television documentaries, interviews, even museums began telling his story. American veterans who once fought against him reached out, not in hostility but in respect. One wrote to him, "We never met in the air, but I'm proud to have shared the same sky with you." Bay responded simply, "Thank you. We were both doing our duty. That is enough." It was a quiet reconciliation, one that only true warriors could understand. In his final years, Nguyen Van Bay's health began to fade. He no longer flew, but he often visited air bases to speak to young pilots. His voice had grown softer, his movements slower, but his eyes still burned with that same fire, the same calm determination that had guided him through dogfights decades before. He would stand beside their aircraft, place a hand on the metal, and whisper, "Fly with heart, fly with honor, and always come home." When he passed away in 2019, the nation mourned, and the government held a state funeral. Old pilots, young cadets, and civilians from across the country came to pay their respects. On that day, the sky above Long On was clear, not a single cloud. For a moment it felt as if the heavens themselves stood still to honor the man who once ruled them. Even now his name lives on, not just in military records, but in the hearts of those who understand what true heroism is. Nguyen Van Bay didn't fight for fame, half fought for home. He didn't seek glory. He sought peace. He was a man who rose from the soil, flew among the stars, and returned to the earth with grace. And so, the story of Nguyen Van Bay reminds us that courage is not loud, it does not demand attention, it simply acts when it must. He was the farmer who became a warrior, the warrior who became a legend, and the legend who chose to live as a man of peace. When we look up at the skies over Vietnam today, calm, bright, and free, we can almost hear the echo of his MiG cutting through the clouds, and the soft whisper of his voice carried by the wind. Protect what you love, that is all that matters.